Hey, happy Friday. Today I am coming at you with a reading journal and two plays in order to talk about one book, that book being Private Rites by Julia Armfield. So hi, my name is Melody. We talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel, and on Fridays we dive deeper into a book, so I would love to have you along for the ride if that sounds of interest to you. Now, this is an eco-horror lesbian lear from the author of Our Wives Under the Sea, which is a favorite on this channel. But before we dive all the way into this book, because of its expansive exploration of themes of climate change and the effects of climate change and using that through a horror lens, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the fires ravaging California right now. While this book deals with a different element in water, it is a stark and harrowing reminder of the reality we are kind of facing right now in many forms. And so I'm going to leave links, including the Book Industry Charitable Foundation, or BINC, which helps booksellers and book industry professionals that need to get back up on their feet after an emergency or a tragedy, such as what you're witnessing. And there are a lot of matching programs going on right now for them in order to help booksellers that are impacted by these fires. So I generally don't really love dystopias, as we've discussed, and also man versus nature is not one of my go-to themes. And both come into play in this book in some ways, though man versus nature, I would argue a lot less than you may expect, with the kind of reality of the torrential rains that have impacted the society of this book being such a central focus. But it is very much a given circumstance, and it also connects back to Lear in a lot of ways. Now, if you remember Our Wives Under the Sea, we were also dealing with water a lot in that book, and so I was not surprised to see water feature so heavily here thematically, but also in a way was, in the sense that we were seeing kind of a callback to some of those thematic explorations from Our Wives Under the Sea. And while I haven't read all of Armfield's work, it is kind of starting to set an authorial language or precedent for me, or at the very least indicate to me what she as an author is interested in exploring right now. Now, I started this on the train last week, which means nothing to you, but it took me about a week to finish this book because I went on a side quest where I tracked down Lear to reread Lear, because I had not read King Lear since, according to my Goodreads, March of 2009. And to be completely frank, I don't really remember the context of reading the play for the first time. I am assuming because we didn't, I don't think, study it in school. We focused much more heavily on Macbeth if we did, so we maybe had one classroom discussion. The more likely scenario I'm thinking of is that I had bought a book of 3 of Shakespeare's tragedies, I believe at the book fair, those 3 tragedies being Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, and King Lear. And so likely as a completionist, I just read King Lear. Now, of course, then it wasn't the Folger edition, which I think are the most accessible, but that meant that I just kind of had the general gist of Lear going back into it. The 3 daughters, the Fool, the Mad King, the Storm. And if I'm gonna be honest with you, that's all I really needed. So I reread Lear, I reminded myself of the existence of Edgar and Edmund, but I didn't really need that for the text. Now, I didn't expect to need it, because if Private Rites is successful, and I anticipated Julia Armfield being successful, it stands on its own, right? But I was very interested in where it was going to be in conversation with Lear, because it has so specifically been talked about in context of King Lear. And honestly, part of that may just be getting ahead of things as well, because the minute you introduce 3 daughters and a kind of inheritance of whatever form, you are going to have those Lear comparisons, but it is in conversation with the work, as we've talked about many times. However, I mentioned that I had 2 plays. The other play I didn't reread, but the beginning of the book quotes both King Lear and Tony Kushner's Angels in America, though it notably doesn't specify whether it's quoting Millennium Approaches or Perestroika, so I did have to do some digging. It is Millennium approaches, which does make sense because I would argue that's the more well-known of the two plays. However, Perestroika really does have some amazing quotes as well, obviously. So the King Lear moment that the book quotes is, "We that are young shall never see so much nor live so long." And in revisiting Lear, that is quite literally, spoiler alert, the end, the last two lines of the play. And so that is very interesting, thinking of that in context and thinking of these characters in context and this idea of live so long, which we feel this sense throughout the book with this presence of the rains and the floods and transportation going down, and the way that transportation has been kind of adapted to the current circumstance, and the way that the entire world is kind of patchworked together in the wake of this climate disaster. And of course, we have the symbolism of the water and the flooding, which is very intentional and apparent, but it's hard to view it currently on simply a symbolic level because it feels like such a potential future, which is why I would categorize this as eco-horror in a lot of ways. It's interesting because Our Wives Under the Sea is also talked about in context of horror, but like Our Wives Under the Sea, I think that this is a quieter book than you may go in expecting. If you've read Our Wives Under the Sea, maybe not, but it has this kind of loneliness and isolation explored, this time through the perspective of three women and a city, which is very interesting narratively, and we will circle back to. But we have this group of sisters, Isla, the oldest, Irene, the middle child, and Agnes, the youngest half-sister. And they are brought together by the narrative, by the death of their father. And so even from the outset, we are seeing distinctions from Lear here in many ways, because we don't have a father at the outset asking his daughters to prove their love and loyalty, but we still have so many threads back to Lear while Armfield manages to make it her own, including like flashbacks back to the father dangling money over them and the way these different sisters react. And the dynamics of these sisters are much different, I would argue, than the dynamics of Lear as well. I kept trying to figure out, especially with their partners, how it fit within the context of Lear, but I don't think with our sisters here and their partners we're drawing any direct correlations to Lear with those partners in any way. Rather, again, it's more of the thematic elements, including the father character of this book, who we see through the kind of corner of the eye of these sisters, is an architect. And so we have this idea of being a ruler of a kingdom in some ways, in the way that he has helped build the society that they know, these houses that can kind of adapt to the realities of weather and water in this world, but also specifically how these houses are kind of out of reach for the everyday person, that they are a status symbol and represent this idea of class within this world that it feels like these sisters are kind of grappling with in some ways, and the narrative is grappling with in some ways, but in a way where it's very subtle and active, even if the book itself doesn't always feel incredibly active. It's interesting because I talked about, you know, the thematic and kind of ecological realities of this book that aren't necessarily my go-tos in terms of thematic explorations. But additionally, at its heart, this is a family drama because it is about the breaking relationship between these three sisters who have been pit against each other their entire life, which we do see as a kind of callback to Lear and the way that they are responding to that, as well as how they are responding to their reality and surroundings and the day-to-day life of things. For instance, Irene, who is the middle sister and considered the most prickly by her sisters, to be clear, they're all kind of prickly in a really interesting and compelling and human kind of way. And we start with Isla, who is a psychologist, and I think that that helps us as a reader kind of get and settle ourselves in the psyches and the heads of these characters and accept those foibles and go along for the ride, and the way that we can see things through all of these sisters' perspectives. But Irene gave up grad school and is working an office job because of the realities of their circumstance, and you know, the circumstance being the flooding. And so we have this symbolism calling back to Lear with the idea of the tempest and the wider world. Now, I have not done a deep analysis of Lear and have never discussed it, unfortunately, in a classroom setting, even in college, so I am not here to give you like really insightful Lear parallels there. But if we're thinking about just, the basics of water symbolism, we have the rebirth and renewal, but we are seeing the kind of flood in this as well. It's also interesting in context of the quote from Lear at the beginning, because one of the lines in Lear that spoke to me the most on this reread was, "Thou shouldest not have been old till thou hast been wise." And this idea of kind of coming up, railing against the storm, but then additionally, the Angels in America section that it quotes that comes from a scene between Lewis and Belize is softness, compliance, forgiveness, grace. And so we are kind of in a crucible in some ways, not to get too convoluted in our play references, but we are thinking about being really in that moment of conflict. And we really are in that moment of conflict, that moment of crisis. We open up with Isla getting the news of her father's death and reaching out to Irene and Agnes, and this bringing back together these sisters who really do not necessarily understand each other. And Agnes in particular has been very separate from her sisters. And not only was Agnes the daughter of a wife that their father left Isla's and Irene's mother for, but Isla and Irene really felt like they were left with the raising of Agnes in a lot of ways. And Agnes doesn't necessarily work to be in contact with them either. She keeps her phone off a lot of the time. And so we were throwing these three women who are also kind of at crisis points in their own life or discontent in some way. We are throwing them back together and forcing them to have a relationship, or seeing what that relationship looks like and if they can have a relationship outside of the realities of just kind of getting through this situation, and if there is an inheritance for any of them from this father, and also just trying to see things from each other's perspective while acknowledging without fully naming the abuse that they faced under their father. And there were little touches that I thought Armfield did so well in kind of showing his character while also tying back to Lear in some ways. For instance, their father used the royal we, which of course we would expect from someone like King Lear, and to a certain extent we would also expect from someone that's really full of themselves and pretentious in the way that this character was. And so it really worked. As the book itself says, King Lear and his dyke daughters, Irene said, and then wished she hadn't, because all of the sisters in this book are queer, and it is just a known and accepted fact of the world. Much later in the book, I believe it's Isla, has a comment to one of the guests at their father's funeral wake that some families even have 3 straight daughters, and we just kind of hear it at the end of a conversation, and it's so late in the book that we are already enmeshed in this world. And there's a really active kind of character study in this, even as it's a very slow moving reflective piece at the end of the day, but it's really mired in these characters to the point where we move throughout the sisters' points of view in a chapter. They're marked whose point of view we're in, and we're in third person in that point of view, but we do move from sister to sister, which is impressive because the book is under 300 pages, and that is a lot of narrative space and kind of emotional landscape to cover for 3 characters and make it feel seamless, make it feel like we have spent time and been mired in this in whatever way, and still have that kind of emotional nuance. Now in part 2, we do get a peek at some of the circumstance through the eyes of Irene and Agnes's partners, and in particular, I really like Jude, Irene's partner's point of view regarding loving a difficult woman, especially as we have seen Irene accept that she is prickly and a difficult woman, but also kind of railing against the fact that her sisters bring that out of her. And she has this really wonderful observation in the beginning of the book that Isla, as her older sister, never kind of lets her grow out of being 17 and the way she reacted to things and her perspectives as an adolescent. And because that is how she is seen by her sister, that is how she behaves and gets stuck in kind of this cycle. And at the same time, we're also able to see her through Isla and Agnes's point of view. And we see the way that she is kind of always on the defensive and always combative. And we see her kind of entering every room with some combative energy or negative energy. There's always an offhand comment that implies that something is kind of wrong. And it's a really nuanced way at looking at these characters. And again, they're all flawed in different ways. And so they're all just really butting heads. And then we get these outside perspectives with, for instance, Jude and Stephanie, but more particularly with the city, whose point of view is literally named City within the book. And here we go from the really zoomed in look at this relationship crisis between these three sisters to the pulled out look of the reality of this city. And so we're seeing the devastation from a really zoomed in and pulled out perspective, which I thought was really interesting because we're seeing the immediacy of that filial kind of breakdown and these personal struggles and the way that the changing of the world has kind of impacted these personal struggles and reflect the interior, the mental interior sometimes as well, especially because if it is rainy all the time, if things are flooding, it's described as humid and muggy and damp, and it's very evocative. And also, those things would make me pretty short of temper as well. Like, that would not be a pleasant living experience. This idea that a lot of things that we take for granted on the daily are considered luxuries, and not in a way where we kind of wax poetic about them being luxuries, but just in a kind of matter of fact tone, but still within Armfield's really poetic and lyrical writing style, which is one of the reasons I, as a reader, am drawn to her so much. And I think that the city perspective is a wonderful example of this lyricism and this voice and writing, because it's almost eulogizing this place and this time. And there is a quote, not within the city perspective, but it says, "Sometimes I think hope is a far less satisfying feeling than despair." And despair really is what it feels like these characters are mired in. And it's an interesting feeling and an inactive feeling in many ways. But we, at the same time, are seeing slight character changes, but it's very slow moving, and it is very much, like I said before, focused on the character study of things, which brings into question where the propulsion is in the novel. Like in Our Wives Under the Sea, we had this mystery that was really kind of driving things, though the rain and the water isn't the only kind of callback to Our Wives Under the Sea. If you remember, there was like an internet component, message board kind of situation in that, and we see that again in this book that Irene kind of pokes around on, but this time it is people role-playing normalcy in our context on a message board and like really emphasizing the utterly mundane. Like, I was able to go buy eggs and I made an omelet with everything that was in my fridge because I could, or I'm bored on a camping trip. The kind of in-between moments of our lives and the way that those are revered, which I think is really illuminating as well in how we consider the psyche of these characters. But the tenseness and the horror of it don't maybe come down solely to the ecological side of things. There are moments of the odd threaded throughout. They're just like blip and you miss it, in the same way where our characters kind of take it for granted that maybe it was just an off moment, maybe it was something out of the corner of the eye. Sometimes there are little things that even our characters don't fully recognize, but as a reader, it is written in such a way that it disquiets a little bit, but it's not necessarily building to anything it feels like within the course of the narrative. For instance, it is emphasized throughout that Agnes's mother is just gone. She just disappeared. And so we do have these kind of lingering mysteries that could become something, but it's unclear what that is. And ultimately, the pacing of these other bits wasn't my favorite because we were so focused on these kind of domestic upsets and it was really unclear where exactly we were going, which is fine. And it did come together in a way where clearly things had been seeded throughout, but the action really just picked up in the last like 30 pages, and it kind of a little bit came from nowhere, or at least it felt like there wasn't enough time to really resolve it. However, at the same time, I recognize the beat that the book left on, and that was obviously very intentional, if for no other reason than it was purposely left on it. But you can tell that there's a lot of thought there in terms of what this book is saying with that ending, especially circling back in context of the opening quotes. And in some ways, that kind of big moment at the end makes sense in comparison because it's something that jars these characters out of their stasis. I mean, they've been jarred out of their stasis already because things have happened over the course of the book, but it's something that just utterly upsets everything while also revealing a lot of things. Now, do all of these revelations make sense? no. At the same time, we are living in a drowning world, and there's a lot of suspension of disbelief that goes into it, or I'm willing to buy. I'm not saying that that reality, unfortunately, requires a lot of suspension of disbelief, but there is already this heightened sense to things. I'm more willing to buy into people's desperation and these kind of impetuous actions, though I don't think impetuous is really the right context or word here, but also just this kind of mystical thinking. However, I would have loved to see a little bit more of it, I think, building up. It's hard because as much as I loved Our Wives Under the Sea, the ending of that was also hard for me. Now, I know people who loved the ending of that book, but it's so weird and the stakes are so high that wrapping it up in any way is hard. And in some ways, I think we're facing the same here because we do have this kind of general unease and how do we wrap that up? And I will say it's much different than Lear. I was expecting a kind of circling back at the end to more closely align with the ending of Lear in some ways, and that didn't necessarily happen. We did have some revelations, or a revelation at the end of part one that kind of brought us back to Lear, but even within the context of the actions of these daughters and what inheritances are offered and which inheritances are taken, even there we go off script. So we really are kind of taking the general shape of the thing, which makes it much more, again, a piece in conversation with the original, which I find incredibly interesting. I love that we're taking ownership in that way. And we really have these very specific vignettes. There's something very evocative about all of the moments in this from the very beginning. Okay, I started this book on the train to work last week. And there is a moment for Irene in the beginning of the book where she is also commuting to work. And she is sitting on the train and she watches a woman vomit into a handbag and hand it to her boyfriend, which is such a specific and frankly gross moment. And then I ended up having to leave work early because I was not feeling well. And that moment was all I could think about on the train ride home. So the timing of that was not my favorite. That's not necessarily the kind of reading serendipity I am looking for. However, the ability to evoke those moments, I really responded to as a reader in this book. And Armfield's language continues to really be excellent, and it allows for really razor sharp insights into character, whether those characters be these three sisters or an entire city, and the way that that becomes a character in and of itself and is contrasted against the specificity of these women. And I think that the balance of that in particular was really well done. And I think at the end of the day, this was a very beautiful, thought-provoking novel, and it was also unsettling while reminding us of our humanity amidst these bigger considerations. In some ways it was interesting because if I go back a little bit to the idea of that end and the kind of oddness that was sprinkled throughout that wasn't fully odd that we could explain away, in some ways that reminds me of The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell, where the odd stuff in that narrative is happening right out of the corner of the eye. And so you can kind of feel it, but you aren't present necessarily within that action. We get gifted being more present in that action within Slade House, but it's interesting to like be in a narrative where you know right out of the corner of the eye something really weird and interesting is going on, and we can see that impact on the main narrative, but we don't really get to be privy to that oddness. And in some ways, that is also kind of what is going on here. I'm not saying it is exact by any means, because it is far from, but I think it might evoke similar feelings. So there is a lot to dig into with this book. Again, it is short like Our Lives Under the Sea, but it packs a lot within a little space and has a lot of really big considerations. And it also has a lot of intertextuality, both with King Lear and, I would argue, with Our Wives Under the Sea, as we have these kind of callbacks and these reoccurring themes that I will definitely be keeping my eye on as a reader within Armfield's work to see how that presents in other narratives. So if you've read this, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. I feel like we could have really in-depth thematic discussions about so many different angles of this. So I really am kind of doing the broad strokes here, but thank you for being interested in those broad thoughts. Again, leave your thoughts below if you have read this book, like and subscribe if you feel like it, read something good, and yeah, bye.